Hello, we're going to work on section 4.3, solving quadratic equations by factoring. This is Mrs. Beasley. Don't forget to have your notes out, ready to jot down some items and pause whenever you want to pause, because tomorrow we're going to go ahead and go over some problems concerning this section. So we're going to look at vocab, factored form. That's when you are able to see parentheses, timesing occurring between each of the parentheses as the first vocab. FOIL, first, outer, inner, last. That's when you multiply those terms given two binomials. It's also a form of distribution, so whatever's easier for you. Here is a visual on what first, outer, inner, last represent when you do have an example of x minus 6 times x minus 2, where the x's get multiplied because those are the first terms, outer terms, the x and a negative 2, inner and last terms get multiplied. The zero product property is a way to solve for x. You just take each of the factors, each of the parentheses, set them equal to 0 and solve for x. In this case, x plus 3 equals 0, x minus 5 equals 0. So I end up with x equals negative 3 and x equals positive 5. This is kind of working backwards. They give us the answers, the roots, the zeros. They give it to us and we just go backwards and plug them into the factored form of x minus a half and x minus a negative 5. So I end up with x minus a half and x plus 5 when I simplify. When I multiply it out, I end up with fractions. So I then go ahead and multiply by 2 to get rid of my fractions. So I end up with 2x squared plus 9x minus 5 equals 0 is the standard form for my equation that had the roots of a half and negative 5. GCF is another way to factor. Matter of fact, that's the one I always use first when I'm asked to factor. I see what they have in common. Well, the 9y squared and the 3y have 3's in common and a y in common. So they come out of the parentheses, and what is left when I divide those two by 3y is in the parentheses, and then I do the zero product property. Here's another example where I go ahead and find out what they have in common, which is 5y, and then I end up with a minus 4 on the inside. When I do the zero product property, it ends up with 0 and 4 as an answer. Another concept of factoring is a perfect squares and difference of squares. You just go ahead and notice the first term x squared and the last term 9 are both perfect squares. When that happens, you can go ahead and I square root them, and you end up with x minus 3. The minus comes from the term itself where it says x squared minus 6x, the middle term. And then those two you can do the zero product property of. Another example is y squared equals 36. You can bring that 36 over since they're both perfect squares, and notice the difference means minus. So you'll end up with a y plus 6 and y minus 6 as the two parentheses, and then do the zero product property to solve your answers. When you're factoring trinomials, you can go ahead and find out, multiply a times c, which is negative 15, and find out what multiplies to negative 15 and at the same time adds to negative 2. So you would just do trial and error, and then when you find the two numbers, you go ahead and put them in the middle as 3x and minus 5x. Those are the two numbers that work. You go ahead and group, factor by grouping. So the first two get grouped, the last two get grouped. GCF each group. You end up with your two binomials, which then you can go ahead and do the zero product property. Another example, once again, multiply a times c, which is 5 and 24. And then see, when you multiply those, get 120 and adds to 34. So it looks like the two terms are 4 and 30. So you do 5x squared plus 4x plus 30x plus 24. Factor by grouping, GCF each of the groups. X and the 6 come out. They go into one parentheses, do the zero product property. You get your answers of x equals negative 6 and x equals negative 4/5. There they are. And don't forget, you can always pause these, rewind them. That's the beauty of these recordings. Anytime you need to slow it down, you may do so. And I would strongly suggest it. So those are my roots, my zeros. So now we have an architect example, and we have an arch that we're dealing with, which is in the shape of parabola, which is a quadratic. I'm going to go ahead and see that equation they give us there, and always look what the variables stand for. X is the horizontal distance, so that's left to right. H is the vertical distance, and it looks kind of weird to me, 9 minus x squared, so I'm going to rewrite it by multiplying by -1. So we have the x squared minus 9 equals 0. Do the zero product property, factor it, x plus 3x minus 3, because it's the difference of squares. With the zero product property, we get -3 and 3. And since they wanted the horizontal distance, we go ahead and subtract them to find the distance, and we get an answer of 6 feet.